The red sun was setting over the colony called New Mesa, and the sky turned orange and purple like fire spreading across clouds. Maria Redhawk stood near the main building where people gathered every evening to talk about their day and share news from other settlements. She was 26 years old and strong in ways that made people respect her, without her having to demand it. Her dark eyes watched everything and missed nothing. Her grandmother had been Apache back on Earth, and Maria carried that heritage in her blood and in her heart. She was the head of defense for the whole colony, which meant she was responsible for keeping everyone safe from the dangerous animals that roamed the grasslands and sometimes from raiders who came looking for supplies they had not earned. The planet Kepler 442b was not an easy place to live. The grass grew tall and red instead of green, and the animals had teeth like knives and moved faster than anything Maria had seen in videos of Earth. But humans were stubborn, and they had made this place home anyway. They built their houses from local materials and grew food in greenhouses and sent scouts out every day to make sure nothing dangerous was coming close to the settlement. It was hard work, but it was honest work, and Maria believed in it with everything she had. Jake Morrison was one of those scouts. He had been working the frontier for 3 years, and in that time, he had saved more lives than anyone could count. He flew his small ship out into the grasslands every morning before the sun came up, and he did not come back until after dark. He looked for predators and checked on the remote sensor stations, and sometimes he found colonists who had gotten lost or injured, and he brought them home. He was tall and lean with skin that had been weathered by wind and sun until it looked like old leather. His eyes were gray like storm clouds, and they were always watching and always calm. But the thing people noticed most about Jake Morrison was that he almost never talked. He would nod or shake his head or sometimes grunt, but actual words were rare as rain on this dry planet. Some people thought he was rude, but Maria knew better. She had worked with him for 3 years, coordinating patrols and defense strategies, and she had learned that his silence was not rudeness. It was just who he was. He spoke with his actions instead of his words, and his actions were always good and always reliable. Maria respected Jake more than almost anyone else in the colony. He had saved her life twice. Once when a pack of razor cats had surrounded her survey team, and once when her transport had crashed in the Badlands, and he had searched for 3 days straight without sleeping until he found her. He never asked for thanks or recognition. He just did what needed to be done, and then went back to his quiet life. Maria thought that was admirable, but she also found it frustrating because she never knew what he was thinking or feeling. On this particular evening, Jake did something completely unexpected. He walked up to Maria while she was standing outside the main building, and he spoke more words in a row than she had ever heard from him. His voice was rough, like he was not used to using it, which was probably true. He said, "Maria, I want to court you proper." He said, "I know I am not much for talking, but I would like to try." He said, "I have been thinking on it for a while now." Maria felt like the ground had shifted under her feet. People were walking past them going about their business, but she felt like the whole world had narrowed down to just her and Jake standing there in the fading light. She looked at him and saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. Vulnerability, hope, fear of rejection. This man who faced down predators without flinching was afraid of what she might say. Maria took a breath and spoke as gently as she could. She said, "Jake, you are a good man." She said, "You are one of the best men I know." She said, "But I need someone who can talk to me, who can share what they are thinking and feeling." She said, "Your silence might be strength out in the grasslands, but in a relationship I would feel like I was living with a ghost." She said, "I am sorry." Jake just nodded once. His face did not change expression at all. He said understood in that same rough voice, and then he touched the brim of his hat the way cowboys did in the old videos, and he walked away into the gathering darkness. Maria watched him go and felt a strange ache in her chest, like maybe she had made a mistake, but she pushed that feeling down. She had been honest with him. She had told him what she needed. That was the right thing to do. What Maria did not see was Jake climbing into his scout ship with hands that shook so hard he could barely work the controls. What she did not hear was the way he sat in the pilot seat for 10 minutes just breathing hard, like he had run a marathon. What she did not know was that he spoke one word to himself in the darkness of that cockpit. He said, "Change." The next morning, Jake filed paperwork for extended leave. He told the colony administrator that he needed to take care of some personal business on the core worlds. He did not say what kind of business, and nobody asked because Jake Morrison had earned the right to his privacy. He packed his few belongings into a single bag and loaded it onto his ship. By the end of the week, he was gone. People in New Mesa talked about it for a while. Jake Morrison leaving was big news because he had been such a fixture of the colony for so long. Some people said he had finally gotten tired of frontier life and was going back to civilization. Others said he must have family business to attend to. A few people who knew about his conversation with Maria speculated that he had left because of her rejection, but most people dismissed that as gossip. Maria did not talk about it with anyone. She threw herself into her work harder than ever. She reorganized the patrol schedules and upgraded the sensor network, and ran training drills until everyone was complaining about how demanding she had become. At night, she lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling, and tried not to think about gray eyes and rough hands and a man who had offered her his heart in the only way he knew how. 3 months passed, and then 6 months, and then a year, and Jake Morrison did not come back. The colony hired new scouts to replace him, but none of them were quite as good. They were competent and they did their jobs, but they did not have that almost supernatural ability to sense danger that Jake had possessed. Maria noticed this, but she did not say anything. She had made her choice and she had to live with it. Life on New Mesa continued the way it always had. The colony grew slowly, adding new families and new buildings. They expanded their farming operations and established a second settlement 50 kilometers to the east. Maria got promoted to security chief, which meant she was responsible for even more people and even more territory. She was good at her job and people trusted her to keep them safe. But sometimes late at night when the wind howled across the grasslands, Maria would think about Jake Morrison and wonder where he had gone and what he was doing and whether he ever thought about her. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself she had made the right decision. She told herself that she did not miss him. But deep down in a place she did not like to examine too closely, she knew that all of those things were lies. Jake Morrison traveled to the core worlds on a ship that took 3 weeks to make the journey through hyperspace. He spent those 3 weeks thinking about what Maria had said to him. She needed someone who could talk, who could share what they were thinking and feeling. She was right. He had spent so many years being silent that he had forgotten how to connect with people in any meaningful way. He had become a ghost, just like she said. His first stop was a planet called New Geneva, where the best diplomats in human space were trained. The buildings were tall and white and beautiful, and Jake felt completely out of place walking through the manicured gardens and marble hallways. He was a frontier scout with calloused hands and worn clothes, and everyone else looked like they had been born in fancy suits, but he did not let that stop him. He walked into the admissions office and applied for the diplomatic training program. The admissions counselor looked at him like he was crazy. She asked him why a scout wanted to learn diplomacy, and Jake said, "Because I need to learn how to talk to people." The counselor raised her eyebrows, but she processed his application anyway. A week later, Jake got accepted into the program, mostly because his test scores were perfect and his letters of recommendation from New Mesa made it clear he was reliable and brave. The classes were harder than anything Jake had ever done. Learning to fly a ship or track predators was easy compared to learning rhetoric and debate and negotiation theory. He sat in classrooms with young people fresh out of university who had spent their whole lives studying communication, while he had spent his whole life avoiding it. They could talk circles around him at first, but Jake had one advantage. He was used to hard work and he never gave up on anything he started. Every morning, Jake woke up at 5 and practiced speaking out loud. He read books and articles and then summarized them, speaking to his reflection in the mirror. He recorded himself and played it back and cringed at how awkward he sounded, but he kept doing it day after day, week after week. He learned that talking was like any other skill. It got easier with practice. He learned that words had power when used correctly. He learned that silence could be a choice instead of a default. After 6 months, Jake could hold his own in class discussions. After a year, he was winning debates. His instructors were amazed at his progress. One of them told him that she had never seen anyone work so hard to change themselves. Jake just nodded and kept working because he knew that learning to talk in a classroom was not enough. He needed to learn to talk in the real world where things mattered and people's lives were on the line. He finished the diplomatic training program in 2 years instead of the usual 4 by taking extra classes and working twice as hard as everyone else. He graduated with honors and several job offers from fancy diplomatic corps that served the core worlds. He turned them all down. Instead, he joined a humanitarian relief organization that sent people to colonies that were suffering from disasters or conflicts. The pay was terrible and the conditions were harsh, but that was exactly what Jake needed. He traveled to a colony that had been hit by earthquakes and helped organize the survivors. He went to a settlement where disease had killed half the population and convinced the frightened people to accept medical help. He visited places where human colonists and native species were fighting over resources and tried to find compromises that both sides could live with. Each assignment taught him something, knew about communication and about people and about himself. The breakthrough came on a planet called New Cheyenne, 3 years after Jake had left New Mesa. The colony there was at war with the native species, called the Kraloth, who were tall and proud and very dangerous. The colonial government had sent 3 diplomats to negotiate peace, and all 3 had been killed. The situation was spiraling toward total war, and everyone expected thousands of deaths on both sides. Jake volunteered to try negotiating with the Kraloth. The colonial administrators thought he was suicidal. The other relief workers tried to talk him out of it. But Jake had studied Kraloth culture, and he thought he understood something that the previous diplomats had missed. The Kraloth respected courage and honesty above everything else. The previous diplomats had come with armed guards and made promises they could not keep. Jake decided to do the opposite. He went alone. He carried no weapons. He rode a small transport into Kraloth territory, and when their warriors surrounded him, he got out slowly and raised his hands to show he meant no harm. He asked to speak with their war chief. The Kraloth warriors were so surprised by his courage or his stupidity that they took him to their leader instead of killing him on the spot. The war chief was a massive being covered in scars from a lifetime of battles. He looked at Jake with eyes that had seen too much death and asked why he should not kill another human diplomat. Jake said, "Because I am not here to lie to you or make promises I cannot keep." He said, "I am here to admit that my people have done wrong and to ask what it would take to make things right." That honesty surprised the war chief. For 3 days, Jake sat in the Kraloth lodge and talked. He listened to their grievances and acknowledged every valid point. He explained the human perspective without making excuses. He asked questions and learned about Kraloth values and customs. He proposed solutions that respected both species. He spoke from the heart about his belief that war served no one and peace served everyone. On the 4th day, the war chief extended his hand in the Kraloth gesture of peace. The war was over. Jake had accomplished what no one else could. He had ended a conflict that everyone thought was inevitable. News of the New Cheyenne peace spread through the frontier colonies faster than light. Jake Morrison, the silent scout who had become a diplomat, was suddenly famous, but Jake did not stop working. He continued traveling from colony to colony, helping resolve disputes and build bridges between different groups. His reputation grew with each success. People started calling him when they had problems that seemed impossible to solve. He mediated territorial disputes and trade disagreements and cultural conflicts. He trained other diplomats in his methods, which focused on honesty and respect and finding solutions that benefited everyone involved. 5 years after leaving New Mesa, Jake had become one of the most respected negotiators in human space. He had prevented wars and saved lives and built relationships between species that had seemed like natural enemies. He had proven that words could be more powerful than weapons when used by someone who truly believed in peace. He had changed himself completely, from a man who could barely speak to a man who could convince anyone of anything. But through all of his travels and all of his successes, Jake never forgot why he had started down this path. Every night before he went to sleep, he thought about Maria Redhawk. He wondered if she would recognize him now. He wondered if he had changed enough to be worthy of her. He wondered if she ever thought about him or if she had moved on with her life and found someone else. He told himself that it did not matter because he had not changed himself just for her. He had changed himself because she had been right about who he was and who he needed to become. Jake kept a picture of New Mesa on his personal device. Sometimes he would look at it and remember the red grasslands and the orange sky and the feeling of belonging somewhere. He missed the frontier. He missed the honest work of scouting. He missed the people who did not care about fancy words and just wanted someone they could count on. Most of all, he missed Maria, even though he had only spent 3 years knowing her, and she had rejected his clumsy attempt at courtship. While Jake was transforming himself across the galaxy, Maria was dealing with her own challenges on New Mesa. The colony had grown significantly in the 5 years since Jake left. What had been a single settlement of 3,000 people was now 3 settlements with over 15,000 colonists spread across the northern continent. Maria had been promoted to security chief, which meant she was responsible for keeping all of those people safe. It was not easy work. The planet seemed determined to kill humans at every opportunity. The predators got bigger and smarter the farther from the main settlement you went. Raiders from pirate groups occasionally tried to steal supplies. Equipment failed at the worst possible times. But Maria handled every crisis with the same calm competence that had made her valuable from the beginning. People trusted her to make the right decisions, and she rarely let them down. She had trained new scouts to replace Jake and upgraded the sensor, networks and established rapid response teams that could reach any settlement within an hour. She worked 16-hour days and slept in her office more nights than she slept in her own quarters. Some people said she was married to her job, and they were not wrong. Maria threw herself into work because it was easier than thinking about the choices she had made and the person she had let walk away. Then the Vorthen arrived and everything changed. They came out of hyperspace in a massive fleet of generation ships that had been traveling between stars for decades. Their homeworld had been destroyed by an expanding sun 2 generations ago, and they had been searching for a new planet ever since. When their sensors detected New Mesa and saw that humans had already established colonies, they made a decision that would threaten everything Maria had worked to protect. The Vorthen sent a message to the colonial government. It was simple and direct. They said, evacuate the planet within 30 days or we will remove you by force. They said, we have 50,000 warriors and weapons that can level your settlements from orbit. They said, we do not want war, but we will have this planet. They said you have 30 days to decide. The Colonial Council met in emergency session. Governor Patricia Stone was a tired woman in her 60s who had spent 20 years building New Mesa into something worth protecting. She looked at the council members with eyes that had seen too much disappointment and said, we need to discuss our options. Councilman Victor Chen, who was young and angry, said we should call for military support from Earth. Councilwoman Betty Harris, who was old and practical, said we should begin evacuating immediately because we cannot win a fight against those numbers. Maria sat in the back of the council chamber, listening to them argue. The military option was pointless because the nearest Colonial Navy battle group was 6 months away. The evacuation option was almost as bad because their ships could only carry 8,000 people at most, which meant half the colony would be left behind. Neither choice was acceptable, but those seemed to be the only choices they had. She stood up and her voice cut through the arguing. She said there has to be another way. She said we cannot just abandon everything we have built here. She said people have died to make New Mesa work and we owe it to them to find a solution. Governor Stone looked at her with sympathy and said sometimes survival means accepting hard truths, Chief Redhawk. She said we are facing an enemy we cannot defeat. She said evacuation might be our only option. Maria felt frustration building in her chest like pressure before an explosion. She said then we negotiate. She said we find a way to share this planet. She said Kepler 442b is huge and there is room for both species if we can just make them see reason. Councilman Chen laughed bitterly and said the Vorthen have refused every attempt at communication. He said they have made their position clear. He said they want us gone and they have the power to make it happen. Maria paced back and forth trying to think. There had to be someone who could negotiate with the Vorthen, someone who could find common ground where none seemed to exist, someone who could talk to anyone and make them listen. And suddenly she thought of a name she had not spoken aloud in 5 years. She thought of gray eyes and rough hands and a man who had left New Mesa to become someone different. She said Jake Morrison. The council chamber went quiet. Some people remembered the name, but many did not because 5 years was a long time, and Jake had never been one to draw attention to himself. Maria said Jake Morrison was our best scout, and he left 5 years ago to train as a diplomat. She said I have been following his career, and he has become one of the best negotiators in human space. She said he ended the war on New Cheyenne when everyone thought peace was impossible. She said if anyone can convince the Vorthen to negotiate, it is him. Governor Stone leaned forward with interest in her tired eyes. She said, do you think he would come back here after all this time? She said, do you think he would help us? Maria met her gaze and said, I do not know, but I have to try. She said, Jake is from here and he understands what this place means to people. She said he spent 3 years protecting this colony, and I believe he still cares about what happens to it. She said, let me contact him and make the case. The council debated for another hour, but eventually they agreed to let Maria try. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain. That night, Maria sat alone in her office, staring at a blank message screen, trying to figure out what to say. How do you ask someone you rejected for help? How do you reach across 5 years of silence and absence? How do you admit that you might have been wrong about everything? She started recording and deleted it 3 times before she finally said the words that felt right. She said, Jake, this is Maria Redhawk calling from New Mesa. She said, I imagine you are surprised to hear from me. She said, I need your help, and so does everyone who lives here. She explained the situation with the Vorthan carefully and honestly. She told him about the ultimatum and the impossible odds and the failure of conventional diplomacy to make any progress. Then she said something that surprised even herself. She said, I have heard about everything you have accomplished. She said, I know about New Cheyenne and all the other places where you have made peace possible. She said, you have become exactly the person I told you that you needed to be. She said, I am proud of you even though I have no right to be. She said, I am asking you to come home and help us, not because you owe us anything, but because you are the only person I trust to find a way through this. Maria ended the recording and sent it through the hyperspace communications network that connected the colonies. Then she waited. She tried to work on other things, but her mind kept drifting back to the message. She wondered where Jake was and what he was doing. She wondered if he would even respond. She wondered if he hated her for rejecting him all those years ago. She wondered if asking him to come back was selfish or necessary or both. 18 hours later, her communication terminal chimed with an incoming message. Maria almost did not want to open it because she was afraid of what it might say, but she took a deep breath and activated the recording. Jake Morrison appeared on the screen, and Maria felt her breath catch in her throat. He looked the same but different. Older, more confident. His eyes held a depth they had not possessed before. And when he started speaking, his voice was warm and clear, and nothing like the rough, uncertain tone she remembered. He said Maria, and just hearing him say her name made something break open in her chest. He said, I will come. He said, I will do everything in my power to help New Mesa. He said, but I will not come alone. He said, I have friends and colleagues who believe in what we do, and they have agreed to help. He said, we will arrive in 7 days. He said, tell your people to hold on because help is coming. Then the recording ended, and Maria sat in stunned silence, staring at the blank screen. The 7 days of waiting were the longest of Maria's life. She threw herself into preparations for whatever was coming. She organized the security forces and made sure the shelters were stocked and ready. She coordinated with the other settlements to establish evacuation protocols in case negotiations failed. She did everything she could think of to prepare, but mostly she just waited and worried and wondered what Jake would be like after 5 years of becoming someone new. The colonists of New Mesa reacted to the news in different ways. Some were hopeful when they heard that help was coming. Others were skeptical because one diplomat, even a famous one, could not possibly stand against 50,000 Vorthan warriors. A few were angry that the council was putting their faith in someone who had left the colony years ago. But most people were just scared and willing to grasp at any hope, no matter how slim it seemed. On the 7th day, the sky above New Mesa began to fill with ships. They came in groups of 10 and 20, descending through the atmosphere like a meteor shower made of metal and hope. Maria stood at the edge of the main landing field with Governor Stone beside her and watched the ships arrive. She counted them as they touched down on the red dirt, sending up clouds of dust that caught the afternoon light. 10 ships, 20 ships, 50 ships. They kept coming until the landing field was crowded with vessels of every size and design. When the count reached 500 ships, Maria felt something break inside her chest. Jake had not just come home. He had brought an army, not an army of soldiers, but an army of diplomats and negotiators and bridge builders. 500 people who had dropped everything they were doing to answer Jake's call and help a colony they had never heard of. It was the most incredible thing Maria had ever seen. Word spread through the settlement faster than wildfire. People came running from their homes and workplaces to see the ships. They lined the edges of the landing field and stood on rooftops and climbed anything that would give them a better view. Children pointed at the ships with wide eyes. Adults whispered to each other, trying to process what they were seeing. The mood shifted from fear and resignation to something that felt almost like hope. The first ship to open its sign Airlock was a modified scout vessel that Maria recognized because it was the same type Jake had flown when he worked for New Mesa. The ramp extended and a figure appeared in the doorway silhouetted against the internal lights. Maria's heart hammered in her chest as Jake Morrison stepped out into the sunlight of his former home. He had changed in ways that went beyond the obvious physical details. He still moved with the quiet confidence of a scout, but now there was something else in his bearing. A presence that made people pay attention, an authority that came from knowing his own worth. He wore practical clothing that was neither military, uniform nor fancy suit, but something in between that marked him as someone who worked in difficult places doing important things. Jake walked down the ramp and across the landing field directly toward where Maria stood. Behind him, the other ships were opening and people were emerging, but Maria barely noticed them because all of her attention was fixed on the man approaching her. When he got close enough for her to see his eyes, she felt something twist in her stomach. Those gray eyes that she remembered were the same but different. They held warmth now and openness and a kind of steady strength that had nothing to do with silence. Jake stopped in front of her and extended his hand formally. He said, "Chief Red Hawk, thank you for giving us this opportunity." His voice was rich and warm and completely different from the rough, uncertain tone she remembered. Maria took his hand and felt the familiar calluses, but also felt the difference in how he held himself. This was not the silent scout who had walked away 5 years ago. This was someone who had remade himself completely. She said, "Jake, it is good to see you." Her voice came out rougher than she intended because there was emotion clogging her throat. He smiled and it transformed his face the way the sun transforms the sky at dawn. He said, "It is good to be home, Maria." Then he turned to face the crowd that had gathered, and Maria saw how naturally he commanded attention now. People quieted down to hear what he would say. Jake's voice carried across the landing field clear and strong. He said, "People of New Mesa, I know you are afraid." He said, "You are facing an impossible choice between abandoning your homes and fighting an enemy you cannot defeat." He said, "But I am here to tell you there is a third option." He gestured to the ships and the people still emerging from them. He said, "These 500 people represent the best of what humanity can be." He said they are negotiators and mediators and specialists who have ended wars and prevented conflicts across dozens of worlds. He said the Vorthen are not our enemies. He said they are refugees who are desperate and displaced, and they see taking this planet as their only option for survival. He said our job is to show them that cooperation serves their interests better than conquest. He said we need to prove that sharing this world benefits both species more than fighting over it. He said this will not be easy, but nothing worth doing ever is. Jake paused and let his words sink in. Maria watched the faces in the crowd and saw doubt beginning to shift into something that might become belief. He said, "Over the next week, my team and I will work with your leaders to develop a proposal for coexistence." He said, "We will study Vorthen culture and understand their needs and craft a solution that works for everyone." He said, "And then we will present it in a way that makes them understand that sharing is not compromise but opportunity." He said, "I will not lie to you." He said, "There is no guarantee this will work." He said, "The Vorthen may reject our proposal and attack anyway." He said, "But I promise you this." He said, "We will give them every possible reason to choose peace." He said, "We will show them that humanity is worth making a deal with." He said, "And if they do attack, they will know exactly what they are destroying." Then Jake raised his voice for the final words. He said, "Hold fast, people of New Mesa." He said, "Help is not just coming." He said, "Help is here." He said, "And together we are going to save this world." The crowd erupted in cheers that seemed to shake the ground. Maria found herself applauding alongside everyone else caught up in the wave of hope that Jake had created with nothing but words and conviction. Governor Stone was wiping tears from her eyes. She leaned close to Maria and said that man could talk the stars out of the sky. Maria nodded, unable to speak because there was too much emotion churning inside her. Pride at what Jake had become. Wonder at the transformation she was witnessing. Regret for the years they had lost. Hope that maybe there could be something between them again. Fear that she did not deserve a second chance. Behind Jake, the 500 volunteers were organizing themselves with practiced efficiency. They were setting up equipment and establishing communication networks and preparing to do the work they had come here to do. Maria recognized some of their faces from news reports. These were not just skilled diplomats. These were legends in their fields. And they had all come because Jake Morrison had asked them to. Jake turned back to Maria after the crowd began to disperse. He said we need to talk about the security situation and coordinate our approach. His tone was professional, but his eyes held something warmer. Maria nodded and said, of course. She said, let me show you to the command center. As they walked across the landing field together, Maria thought about how strange it was that the silent cowboy she had rejected had returned as someone who could inspire thousands with his words. And she wondered if maybe she had been given a gift she did not deserve. The colony hall had been transformed into something that looked like a military command center, and a university library had a baby. Tables were covered with data pads displaying information about Vorthan culture and biology and history. Specialists huddled in small groups analyzing every scrap of intelligence they could gather. Holographic displays showed maps of the planet with different colored zones marking potential settlement areas. The energy in the room was intense and focused, like everyone understood that lives depended on getting this right. Maria found herself working alongside Jake, coordinating security arrangements for the eventual negotiation, while also providing detailed information about New Mesa's resources and capabilities. It was during these long hours of planning that she truly saw how much he had changed. The Jake she remembered would sit through meetings barely speaking unless directly asked a question. This Jake was fully engaged, asking insightful questions and offering suggestions, and synthesizing information from multiple sources into coherent strategies. He had a gift for seeing connections that others missed. When the xenopsychology team presented their analysis of Vorthan's social hierarchy, Jake immediately understood how that information could be used in negotiations. When the economic specialist showed him resource distribution models, he spotted potential compromises that would benefit both species. He listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, everyone paid attention because his words carried weight. On the third evening of preparation, Maria and Jake were working late reviewing intelligence reports about Vorthan military capabilities. The command center had emptied out as other team members went to grab food or catch a few hours of sleep. Maria looked up from her datapad and saw Jake rubbing his eyes with the heels of his hands. Even transformed into a legendary diplomat, he was still human, and humans needed rest. She said, you should take a break. He looked at her and smiled that smile that still surprised her every time she saw it. He said, I could say the same to you. She realized they had been working for 14 hours straight without stopping. She said, fair point. He stood and walked to the window that looked out over the settlement. The lights of New Mesa twinkled in the darkness like artificial stars. Maria joined him there. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, and Maria thought about how different this silence was from the silence that had defined Jake 5 years ago. That old silence had been a wall keeping everyone out. This new silence was a shared space where two people could exist together without needing to fill every moment with words. Finally, Maria asked the question that had been nagging at her since he arrived. She said, why? She said, why did you spend 5 years transforming yourself? Jake turned to look at her. He said, would you believe me if I said it was for you? Maria chose her words carefully. She said, I would believe it started for me, but I think somewhere along the way it became about more than that. Jake nodded and his expression became thoughtful. He said, you are right. He said, when you rejected me, you showed me something I had been avoiding. He said, you called me a ghost, and you were absolutely correct. He said I had stopped being a full person and had become just a function, just someone who did a job and nothing more. He said, but as I learned to communicate, really communicate, I discovered something incredible. He said words are not just tools for expressing what is already inside us. He said they are tools for building bridges, for creating understanding where none existed before. He said on New Cheyenne, when I watched centuries of mistrust begin to crumble, because people were finally talking instead of fighting, I knew I had found my calling. He said not just to win you back, but to prove that most conflicts can be resolved if both sides are willing to listen. Maria felt warmth spreading through her chest. She said, and the 500 people you brought. She said, how did you convince them to drop everything and come here? Jake said, I told them the truth. He said, I told them that New Mesa represents everything we believe in. He said, humanity's right to make a home among the stars, but also our responsibility to do so in a way that respects other species. He said, this is not just about saving one colony. He said it is about setting a precedent for how humanity deals with challenges in the future. He said, if we can negotiate peaceful coexistence with the Vorthan, we prove that humanity's strength is not in weapons, but in our ability to find common ground with anyone. He said we proved that the galaxy is big enough for everyone. Maria looked at this man who had once communicated primarily in grunts and nods and felt something shift inside her. She said, I was wrong about you. She said, 5 years ago I thought your silence was weakness. She said, I did not see that you were just being careful with your words, waiting to use them when they truly mattered. Jake reached out and took her hand. His touch was gentle but firm, and it sent electricity racing up her arm. He said, you were not wrong, Maria. He said, I was weak. He said, I was hiding behind silence because I was afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of being rejected. He said, but you gave me the push I needed to change. He said, for that I will always be grateful. They stood there holding hands, and Maria felt the years of distance between them beginning to close. But then Jake squeezed her hand and released it. He said we should get back to work. He said the Vorthan leadership has agreed to meet with us tomorrow and we need to be ready. Maria nodded, pushing aside the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. There would be time later to explore what was developing between them. For now they had 15,000 lives depending on them to find a solution. They worked through the night refining their proposal and preparing for every possible objection the Vorthan might raise. Jake's team had put together a comprehensive plan that would give the Vorthan an entire continent to themselves while preserving the human settlements in the north. They had identified shared research opportunities that would benefit both species. They had created frameworks for dispute resolution and resource management. On paper it looked perfect, but Maria knew that negotiations rarely went according to plan. As dawn broke over New Mesa, Jake called his team together for a final briefing. Maria stood at the back of the room and watched him address the 500 volunteers who had come to help. He thanked them for their commitment and reminded them why this work mattered. He said, today we are not just negotiating for New Mesa. He said we are negotiating for the future of human expansion into the galaxy. He said we are proving that humanity can be trusted to share space with other species. He said we are showing that cooperation is stronger than conquest. The volunteers responded with quiet determination. These were not people who sought glory or recognition. They were professionals who believed in the work they did. They dispersed to their assigned tasks, preparing the meeting site and gathering last-minute intelligence and coordinating with the colonial government. Maria coordinated security arrangements, making sure that both sides would feel safe during the negotiations. The meeting site Jake had selected was a natural amphitheater about halfway between New Mesa and where the Vorthan fleet was in orbit. Wind had carved the red stone into a bowl shape that provided shelter from the harsh sun while remaining open to the sky. Jake's team spent hours preparing the space, making sure every detail respected both human and Vorthan cultural expectations. They set up translation equipment and holographic displays and comfortable seating arranged in a circle to emphasize equality. By midday, everything was ready. Maria positioned her security team at discreet distances where they could respond to any threat, but would not make the Vorthan feel ambushed. Jake stood at the center of the amphitheater with his senior negotiators flanking him. He looked calm and confident, but Maria knew him well enough now to see the tension in his shoulders. This was the moment everything had been building toward. This was where words would either save 15,000 lives or fail to make a difference. A Vorthan shuttle appeared in the sky, descending toward the amphitheater with surprising grace for something so large. Maria felt her heart rate increase as the shuttle landed and its ramp extended. This was it. Everything depended on what happened in the next few hours. She found herself praying to God she was not sure she believed in. She prayed that Jake's transformation had been enough. She prayed that his words would find purchase in Vorthan hearts. She prayed that the silent cowboy who had learned to speak would prove that communication was stronger than violence. The Vorthan who emerged from the shuttle were impressive in a way that made Maria understand why the Colonial Council had been so afraid. They stood 8 feet tall with 4 arms and skin that shimmered with patterns of light that seemed to shift and change like living tattoos. Their leader moved with the bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime making decisions that determined whether people lived or died. The translator device around his neck identified him as War Commander Thexari. Jake stepped forward to greet them, and Maria was struck by how small he looked next to these towering beings. But Jake did not seem intimidated. He executed a gesture of respect that his xenopsychology team had assured him was appropriate, and said, War Commander Thexari, thank you for agreeing to meet with us. He said, I am Jake Morrison, speaking on behalf of the human colony of New Mesa. His voice was clear and steady, and carried easily across the amphitheater. Thexari studied Jake with eyes that seemed to glow from within. The translation device rendered his words in flat mechanical tones, but Maria thought she could hear weariness underneath. He said, "Your reputation precedes you, Jake Morrison. He said you are known as one who speaks truth even when it is uncomfortable. He said we shall see if this reputation is deserved." Behind him, the other Vorthen took positions in a formation that was both respectful and ready for violence. Jake gestured toward the seating area. He said, "Then let me begin with an uncomfortable truth." He said, "You believe that forcing us to evacuate New Mesa is the most efficient path to securing a home for your people." He said, "You are correct." He said it would be simpler, faster, and would avoid the complications of coexistence. Thexari's light patterns flickered in what might have been surprise. He said, "You concede our point before negotiations even begin." Jake said, "I concede the tactical reality." He said, "But I am here to present a strategic argument." He said, "What is simple in the short term can be catastrophic in the long term." Over the next hour, Jake laid out his case with the precision of a master craftsman building something delicate and strong. He spoke about the galactic community and the diplomatic consequences of conquest. He presented data on resource distribution, showing how cooperation could provide both species with more than either could achieve alone. But more than facts and figures, Jake spoke to something deeper. He talked about what it meant to be a refugee, to carry the weight of an entire civilization. He acknowledged the Vorthen's pain and their desperation, and their justified anger at a universe that had taken their home world. He said, "You have been wandering for 2 generations. He said, "Your children have been born and raised on ships, never knowing what it feels like to stand on natural ground." He said, "I cannot imagine the strength it has taken to preserve your culture through such hardship." Maria watched Thexari's light patterns shift to darker colors. The war commander said, "You speak pretty words, human." He said, "But words will not house my people." He said, "Words will not feed the children who cry themselves to sleep in the cold metal of our ships." His voice through the translator carried a weight of accumulated suffering that made Maria's chest ache. This was not a cruel being. This was a desperate leader trying to save his people by any means necessary. Jake said, "No words alone will not house or feed your people." He said, "But words can build partnerships that will provide housing and food more reliably than conquest ever could." He said, "Let me show you what I mean." He activated the holographic display, and suddenly the air between them filled with a 3-dimensional map of the planet. Jake began pointing out regions, explaining the proposal his team had developed over the past week. He highlighted a massive continent in the southern hemisphere. He said, "This is currently uninhabited by humans." He said, "Our surveys show it is rich in resources and highly suitable for Vorthen biology, based on what we know of your needs." He said, "We propose that this entire continent, over 30 million square kilometers, be designated as Vorthen territory." He said, "You would have complete autonomy to build your settlements and govern yourselves according to your own customs." Jake said, "In exchange, we ask for 3 things. He said, first, that the northern settlements remain under human administration. He said, second, that we establish shared research stations to study this planet together, pooling our knowledge for mutual benefit. He said, third, that we create a joint council to oversee planetary affairs and ensure that neither species infringes on the other's territory. He said this council would have equal representation from both peoples, and all major decisions would require consensus." Thexari's forearms moved in gestures that suggested deep thought. He said, "And what guarantee do we have that humanity will honor this agreement?" He said, "Your species is known for expansionism." He said, "We have studied your history." He said, "You take and justify it with words about destiny and progress." Jake nodded slowly. He said, "That is a fair criticism." He said, "Humanity has not always been a good neighbor." He said, "But we are learning." He said, "The guarantee is that this agreement will be ratified by the Galactic Cooperation Council." He said, "Breaking it would make Earth a pariah among spacefaring civilizations." He said, "More than that, breaking it would be against our own interests." He said, "The research partnership alone will accelerate both our people's development by decades." He said, "We have much to learn from each other." He said, "Your generation ship technology is centuries ahead of ours." He said, "Our terraforming techniques could help you adapt other worlds for Vorthen settlement." Jake leaned forward, and his voice took on an intensity that made everyone present lean in to listen. He said, "But beyond politics and practicality, I ask you to consider this." He said, "What kind of precedent do you want to set?" He said if the Vorthen become known as conquerors, every species you encounter will view you with suspicion and fear. He said your children will grow up in a galaxy where other people see them as threats. He said, but if you become known as partners, as people who chose cooperation over conquest when given the choice, then you build a legacy of honor that will serve your children's children. He said you have a chance here to be remembered not as refugees, who took what they needed by force, but as pioneers who helped establish a new model for how different species can share worlds. He said that is worth more than any amount of territory. He said that is a gift you can give to future generations of Vorthen. Thexari was silent for a long moment. His light pattern shifted through colors that Jake's team had identified as indicating consideration and internal debate. Finally, the war commander spoke. He said, "You paint a compelling picture, Jake Morrison." He said, "But I must consult with my elders and my council." He said, "This decision affects the future of our entire species." He said, "I cannot make it alone no matter how persuasive your arguments." Jake inclined his head respectfully. He said, "Of course," he said, "take all the time you need." He said, "We will remain here ready to answer any questions or address any concerns." The Vorthen delegation withdrew to their shuttle, leaving Jake and his team waiting in the amphitheater. As soon as the shuttle lifted off, Maria walked over to where Jake stood. Other team members were already gathering around him, discussing how the negotiation had gone and what might happen next. But Maria pushed through them until she was standing directly in front of Jake. She said that was incredible. She said, "I have never seen anyone command a room like that." Jake smiled, but she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He said, "Now, we wait and see if it was enough." Kelly Harper, one of the senior negotiators, said, "You gave them everything they needed to say yes." She said, "If they turn this down, it will not be because of anything you did wrong." Jake nodded, but Maria could see doubt creeping in around the edges of his confidence. This was the hardest part of any negotiation. The waiting. The not knowing. The fear that despite your best efforts, it might not be enough. The team dispersed to their ships to rest and prepare for whatever came next. Jake and Maria walked back toward the settlement together. The sun was setting again, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Maria said, "How do you handle it?" She said, "The uncertainty." He said, "You learn to accept that you can only control your own actions, not the outcome." He said, "I did everything I could." He said, "I presented the best possible case for cooperation." He said, "Now it is up to them to decide what kind of future they want." 3 days passed without word from the Vorthen. They were the longest 3 days Maria had ever experienced. She coordinated contingency plans and made sure the evacuation ships were ready just in case. She ran drills with the security forces, preparing them for the possibility that negotiations would fail and conflict would become inevitable. But mostly she watched Jake and marveled at how calm he remained while waiting for an answer that would determine the fate of 15,000 people. Jake spent the time meeting individually with each of the 500 volunteers who had come with him. He thanked them personally for their commitment and their sacrifice. He walked through the settlements talking with colonists and listening to their stories. He learned the names of children and admired gardens that families had cultivated. He wanted to understand what people had built here and why it mattered, because he believed that understanding gave power to his words. Maria found herself watching him from a distance, trying to reconcile the man she saw, now with the silent scout she had known 5 years ago. They were the same person, but also completely different. The core was still there, the quiet strength and the reliability and the courage. But now those qualities were wrapped in communication skills that made him magnetic. People were drawn to him not just because of his reputation, but because he made them feel heard and understood. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, a message came through from the Vorthen. They requested another meeting at the amphitheater. The message gave no indication of what their decision would be. Jake assembled his team, and they made the journey back to the meeting site. Maria came along with her security detail. Her heart was hammering so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. Everything came down to this moment. The Vorthen shuttle arrived precisely on time. When the ramp extended, Maria saw that Thexari had brought a larger delegation this time. There were elderly Vorthen whose light patterns glowed with exceptional brightness, indicating wisdom and age. There were younger warriors standing at attention. There were what looked like scholars or scientists carrying data devices. This was not just the war commander. This was a representation of their entire society. Jake met them with the same calm dignity he had shown before. Maria stood beside him now. She was not just security anymore. She was his partner in what was about to happen. Thixari's patterns displayed colors that Jake's team had identified as representing formal ceremony. He said, "Jake Morrison, the Vorthen have considered your proposal." He said, "We have debated its merits and its risks." He said, "We have examined it from every angle and tested it against our needs and our values." The pause that followed felt like it lasted forever. Maria could feel the weight of 15,000 lives hanging in the balance. She could see the tension in Jake's shoulders even though his face remained calm. Around them, the 500 volunteers stood silent, and the colonists who had followed them to watch held their collective breath. Everything stopped and waited for the next words. Thixari said, "We accept." Two simple words that changed everything. Maria felt her knees weaken with relief. She heard gasps and sobs from the colonists watching. She saw Jake's shoulders drop as the tension drained out of him. But Thixari was not finished speaking. He said, "More than that, we thank you, Jake Morrison." He said, "You showed us something we had forgotten during our long exile." He said that strength can be found in openness, not just in conquest. He said that the greatest victories are those where all parties gain. He extended all four arms in a gesture that clearly meant respect and friendship. He said, "You and your people have given us not just a home, but hope for a better future." He said, "The Vorthen will remember this, and we will honor the agreement you have crafted." He said, "We look forward to building this new world together." Jake stepped forward and clasped the offered arms, human and Vorthen meeting as equals. He said, "The honor is ours, War Commander." He said, "Together we will show the galaxy that coexistence is not just possible, but preferable to conflict." Behind Maria, the colonists erupted in cheers. People were crying and hugging each other and shouting with joy. The 500 volunteers were shaking hands and congratulating each other. Even the Vorthen seemed pleased, their light patterns shifting to colors that suggested satisfaction and hope. Maria felt tears streaming down her face, but she did not care. They had done it. Against all odds, they had found a way to save New Mesa without firing a single shot. The formal treaty was signed that evening in a ceremony attended by representatives from both species. Governor Stone presided, wearing her best formal clothing and looking 10 years younger than she had a week ago. The document was comprehensive, covering territorial boundaries and resource sharing and research partnerships and dispute resolution protocols. But more important than the specific terms was what it represented: a new way forward. A proof that different species could choose cooperation over conflict. That night, New Mesa celebrated like it had never celebrated before. The central plaza filled with music and dancing and laughter. People who had been preparing to lose everything were now looking forward to a future that seemed brighter than ever. The Vorthen sent a small delegation to join the celebration, and while there was awkwardness at first, the shared relief and joy broke down barriers. Children from both species stood together, staring at each other with fascination. The 500 volunteers were treated like heroes, though they kept trying to deflect the praise. They insisted they had only done what anyone would do, though everyone knew that was not true. What they had done was extraordinary. They had dropped their own lives and traveled across the galaxy to help strangers because they believed in the cause. They had proven that humanity at its best was capable of remarkable things. Maria found Jake standing at the edge of the celebration, watching the joy he had made possible. She walked up beside him and stood close enough that their shoulders touched. She could feel the warmth of him through their clothes. She said, 5 years ago you asked me to court you properly, and I said no. She said, I told you I needed someone who could talk to me, who could share what they were thinking and feeling. She said, I told you that your silence made me feel like I would be living with a ghost. Jake turned to look at her, and his expression was careful. He said, you were right to refuse. He said, I was not ready then. Maria said, no, you were not ready then. She said, but you are now. She said, you have proven yourself 1,000 times over. She said, so let me ask you a question, Jake Morrison. She said, now that you have saved my home and saved 15,000 lives, what are you going to do next? Jake smiled, that warm smile that transformed his face. He said, well, I was thinking of sticking around New Mesa for a while. He said there is going to be a lot of work implementing this agreement. He said coordinating with the Vorthen and building joint research stations and making sure both sides honor their commitments. He said it will take years, maybe decades. She said that sounds like a long commitment. He said it is. He said the kind of commitment that would be easier with the right partner. He said someone who understands both the frontier and the importance of building bridges. He said someone brave enough to speak her mind and strong enough to stand her ground. He said someone like you, Maria Redhawk. He took both her hands in his. He said 5 years ago I could barely string 5 words together. He said now I can negotiate treaties and inspire crowds. He said, but do you want to know the first words I learned to say properly? Maria nodded, unable to speak because there was too much emotion in her throat. Jake said I love you. He said I loved you 5 years ago, though I did not have the words or the courage to say it. He said I loved you through all my travels and all my transformations. He said, and I love you now, standing here in the home I left behind, hoping you might give me a second chance. Maria felt tears streaming down her face again, but she was smiling wider than she had smiled in years. She said, you want to know something funny? She said, I think I loved you 5 years ago, too. She said, I just did not realize it until you were gone. She said, I told myself I needed someone who could talk, but what I really needed was someone who knew when words mattered and when actions spoke louder. She said, yes, Jake Morrison. She said, I will give you that second chance. She said, I will partner with you in building this future. She said, and I will love you for as long as you will have me. They kissed there at the edge of the celebration as the red sun set on a world that now belonged to 2 species instead of 1. Around them, people cheered, but Jake and Maria barely noticed. They were too caught up in the moment, too focused on each other. 5 years of separation and transformation and growth had led to this. A second chance. A new beginning. A partnership built on understanding and respect and love that had survived the test of time and distance. The 500-eyed volunteers who had come with Jake began to drift over, forming a loose circle around the couple. Kelly Harper raised her glass and said to Jake Morrison, the silent cowboy who found his voice and used it to change the galaxy. Gregory White added his own toast, saying to Maria Redhawk, the woman who knew what she wanted and waited for the right man to become it. Linda Torres, the psychologist, offered the final word, saying to second chances and personal growth, and the idea that the best relationships are built on who we are, willing to become for each other. The assembled volunteers cheered, and the celebration continued late into the night. But Jake and Maria slipped away after a while, seeking quiet where they could talk properly. They walked to the hill overlooking the settlement where they could see the lights of New Mesa below, and the distant glow of the Vorthen fleet preparing to land their first settlers. They talked for hours, sharing 5 years of experiences and emotions that had been held in reserve. Maria told him about the challenges of running security for a growing colony. Jake told her about the negotiations that had failed and the ones that had succeeded and what he had learned from both. In the weeks that followed, New Mesa transformed in ways both visible and invisible. The Vorthen began constructing their first settlement on the southern continent, using techniques that fascinated human engineers. Their buildings grew organically from local materials shaped by technology that seemed like magic. Human specialists traveled south to observe and learn, while Vorthen scientists came north to study human agricultural methods. The first joint research station was established at the equator, where both species could work together studying the planet's unique ecosystem. Jake and Maria became the bridge between the 2 communities. They coordinated responses to problems as they arose, because there were always problems when different species tried to coexist. Disputes over resource boundaries, misunderstandings about cultural practices, technical failures that required cooperation to fix. But each challenge they faced together made both communities stronger. People learned that differences could be assets instead of obstacles. They learned that cooperation produced better results than competition. Many of the 500 volunteers decided to stay on New Mesa. They found opportunities to continue their work in this new frontier of cooperation. Some became permanent liaisons between human and Vorthen communities. Others established training programs to teach both species about each other's cultures. A few simply fell in love with the planet and decided to make it home. Those who returned to their original colonies carried stories of what had been accomplished and inspired similar efforts across human space. Jake's reputation grew even larger after the New Mesa Treaty. He received requests from dozens of colonies asking for help with their own challenges, but he turned most of them down. He had found his place and his purpose here on this frontier world. He trained other negotiators, instead teaching them the methods he had developed. He said, the goal is not for me to solve every problem, but to create more problem solvers. He said, we need a galaxy full of people who believe that communication is stronger than conflict. Maria continued as security chief, but her role evolved. She was no longer just protecting the colony from external threats. She was helping build systems that prevented conflicts from arising in the first place. She worked with Vorthan security leaders to establish joint protocols. She trained humans and Vorthan to work together on patrol teams. She proved that security did not have to mean separation, that sometimes the best way to stay safe was to build relationships with your neighbors. In the evenings, Jake and Maria would return to their shared quarters and talk about their days. Sometimes they discussed work challenges and strategized solutions together. Sometimes they talked about their hopes for the future, both for New Mesa and for themselves. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence reading or watching the sunset through their window. The silence was different now. It was chosen instead of default. It was a shared space where both of them could exist without needing constant conversation. 2 years after the treaty was signed, Jake and Maria stood together on the same hill where they had reconciled. In the distance, they could see lights from the Vorthan settlements twinkling like new constellations. The planet felt different now. It felt alive in a way it had not before. 2 civilizations building something together. 2 species proving that the galaxy was big enough for everyone who was willing to share. Maria said, "Do you ever regret it?" She said, 5 years of your life spent becoming someone different. Jake shook his head. He said, I did not become someone different. He said, I became more fully myself. He said, you showed me that I was only living half a life, using only half my potential. He said, for that gift I will always be grateful. He turned to her and took both her hands. He said, but there is something I need to ask you. He said something I should have asked properly the first time. He knelt there on the hill under the light of the red sun. He said, Maria Redhawk, will you marry me? He said, will you build a life with me here on this world we saved together? He said, will you wake up beside me every morning and face whatever challenges come our way as partners? He said, will you let me love you for the rest of my life? Maria laughed through her tears. She said yes. She said yes to all of it. She said 1,000 times yes. They married 3 months later in a ceremony attended by both humans and Vorthan. Governor Stone officiated wearing formal robes that had been stored away for special occasions. The 500 volunteers who had stayed on New Mesa all came. Thexari attended representing the Vorthan people, and his light patterns glowed with colors that meant joy and approval. It was a celebration not just of 2 people joining their lives, but of 2 species proving that differences could be bridges instead of walls. Years passed, and New Mesa flourished. The joint research stations produced discoveries that benefited both species. Trade networks developed between human and Vorthan settlements. Children grew up learning both languages and both cultures. Some humans chose to live in Vorthan communities, and some Vorthan chose to live in human settlements. The boundaries that had seemed so important at first began to blur. Jake and Maria built a life together that was everything they had both needed. They challenged each other and supported each other and loved each other through good times and hard times. They raised children who grew up bilingual and bicultural, understanding from birth that the galaxy was full of different peoples, and that difference was something to celebrate. They proved every day that the best partnerships are built on honest communication and mutual respect. The story of New Mesa spread throughout human space and beyond. It became a model for how different species could share worlds peacefully. Other colonies facing similar challenges looked to the treaty as a template. Diplomats studied Jake's methods and tried to replicate his success. But the real lesson was simpler than any method or technique. The lesson was that most beings, regardless of species, wanted the same basic things: safety for their families, opportunity for their children, dignity and respect. And when you started from that understanding, almost any conflict could be resolved. On their 10th anniversary, Jake and Maria climbed their hill one more time. They were older now, with lines around their eyes and gray threading through their hair, but they still held hands like young lovers. They looked down at the settlement that had become a city. They looked at the Vorthan structures in the distance that had become as familiar as their own buildings. They looked at each other and saw everything they had built together. Maria said, "Who would have thought?" She said that the silent cowboy I rejected would come back and save everything. Jake smiled and pulled her close. He said, "You gave me the greatest gift anyone ever gave me." He said, "You showed me who I needed to become." He said, "Everything that happened after that was just me trying to be worthy of you." She said, "You were always worthy." She said, "I just needed time to see it." They stood together watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of fire, and knowing that they had helped build something that would outlast them both, a world where different peoples could live together in peace. a future where cooperation was stronger than conquest, a love that had survived rejection and distance and time to become something unbreakable. The Apache woman had spurned the silent cowboy, and 5 years later, he had returned leading 500 riders. But the real triumph was not in the dramatic rescue or the successful negotiation. The real triumph was in two people finding each other and building something beautiful together. That more than any treaty or agreement was humanity at its finest. And that was a story worth telling across the galaxy.